welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Top Dog Talk podcast. No Dan Kiley today. He is at a work conference down in Dallas, so we won't get Dan's rant today. I know y'all are sad. Dan will not be ranting. What's shaping up to be probably Georgia's cupcake schedule is going to be the rant this week. Dan was on here. No blind draft, no nothing today. We're actually getting into football, and it's been a long time coming. I've had my eye on SEC opponent previews. So, hey, we're going to start out with the first SEC opponent that Georgia plays this year. It is the South Carolina Gamecocks. And to my right, guest co-host today, Andrew Lyon of, as you can see in his bio down there, Gamecocks Digest. It is basically, we're co-workers. Don't work together, but basically co-workers on the same network over at Sports Illustrated. Fan Nation does an awesome job. As I was telling him pre-show, despite never working with them, we kind of were under the same umbrella for about, it's been 6 to 8 months now that we've both been working together at Fan Nation. Does a terrific job talking and covering the Gamecocks. So, hey, what better choice than to bring them on here? Andrew, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, Harrison, absolutely. I really appreciate the introduction. And I'm excited that football is getting closer and closer. We're only like less than 2 months away from it now. So really exciting times.
Absolutely. It's SEC Media Week. I know it's different for the Georgia people because Kirby Smart went up today. No, we're not going to be talking about Media Day. We may get some takes on it next week, but we'll see. I want to talk football. I've been dying to talk football. So, Andrew, let's get right into it. And I wanted because last year when Georgia met in South Carolina, obviously in Williams-Brice Stadium, that was week 2, week 3 of the season. It was early in the year. The teams went on basically to 2 different outcomes. Obviously, South Carolina had a heck of a run at the end of that season. You get 2 ranked wins over Tennessee, over Clemson to end the year. Probably the biggest wins that South Carolina has had since, maybe they knocked off Georgia in 19. Don't quote me on that. Maybe you know of a win that I'm not thinking about. So, Andrew, I just want to start it off. Kind of give us, what changed? What was the difference? What clicked, if anything, about that South Carolina team last year?
Well, Harrison, if I had to give you maybe one change that sort of took place with South Carolina at the end of the regular season this past fall, I would have to say the offense got simplified. Look, South Carolina, they changed offensive coordinators this offseason, or I guess I should say, for technicality's sake, Marcus Satterfield left to go to Nebraska, join up with Matt Rule once again, who he's coached under in the past. And South Carolina, of course, hired Dal Loggins over from Arkansas to be their new play caller. But to get back to what happened last season, Marcus Satterfield, no one denies that the man knows football, but there was a real strong feeling in Columbia, Harrison, that at times Marcus Satterfield overcomplicated things on the offensive side of the football. The verbiage was complex, 16, 17, 18-word play calls. There was a multitude of different personnel groupings, so there was a lack of continuity probably at times in terms of trying to get into a rhythm on that side of the football, especially when you got Spencer Rattler going from an air raid offense at Oklahoma to a more pro-stylish offense here at South Carolina. And Florida was sort of like the game where things bottomed out. And I think that the staff basically recognized, Harrison, that things needed to change. And so one way or another, they got things together before that Tennessee game. And of course, we all remember that night. Spencer Rattler just went off for the game of his life, I would say. And then the Clemson game was a good one as well. And then against Notre Dame, you had some key players out for that one because of some transfers and maybe some guys that were a bit dinged up. But you still had a, decent showing against the Fighting Irish, a very storied program in the sport of college football. So I'm sure that simplifying the offense was not the only thing that happened right before that Tennessee game, Harrison, but that's sort of, I guess, the gist of it that we could all take away from the surface level with what all happened with South Carolina at the end of 2022.
Speaking of, Spencer Rattler, and obviously I do want to get into Marcus Satterfield because I remember I follow Evan Crowell on Twitter, who obviously you worked with for a few months, and now he's covering Tennessee. I remember seeing on the timeline play out where it's like, week after week, there's some criticism that people have of Marcus Satterfield, and y'all are basically trying not to join on board, but you're trying to put out the fire a little bit, like, let it play out. He's young, it's a young offense. So Spencer Rattler, correct me if I'm wrong, but those last maybe 2 games of the season might have been the best of his career. Dating back to his time at OU.
Yeah, no, it definitely was. I mean, the night of the Tennessee game, Spencer Rattler, the thing that was impressive that night was just how well he was seeing everything down the field. And I think, again, you can correlate that back to the fact that there was a lot less formations. There was a lot less, sort of mixing up at the personnel. You saw sort of the same guys out there. Antoine Juice Wells, big time playmaker for South Carolina, wide receiver. Josh Vann was a really solid receiver for the Gamecocks for the past 2 years. He had some really big plays that night. Everybody sort of pitched in, but Spencer Rattler, it just sort of seemed like that was the night where everything clicked for him. He had shown some progression in certain aspects throughout the course of the season and sort of navigating the pocket, not maybe escaping the pocket too quickly. There was a multitude of things that, again, he never had to deal with in an air raid offense at Oklahoma that all of a sudden was different for him when he got to South Carolina. So Spencer Rattler led the charge there. There was no question about that. And I think that for the Gamecocks, you got that one over Tennessee, and I think it just gave them a massive swell of confidence. I mean, what team wouldn't be confident after winning a game like that in that fashion? And so then you carry that over to Clemson, and I think it helped them there. And then a game against Notre Dame, which mainly in the past few years for South Carolina, maybe they would have thought that there was not a very high chance of them winning that game, but they contended with them, went toe for toe with them throughout the entire football game. And so for South Carolina, it was just, I think, an indication of what the program could possibly become. And I'm not saying that means they're going to score 63 points every single time they face like a top 25 opponent, but there are pieces here. And if Shane Beamer and the staff can continue to add to this roster and get some more guys into this program, then, who knows? The ceiling could just rise even more for South Carolina in the coming years.
Absolutely. You went, I mean, just quick overview for folks. Georgia fans are well aware Shane Beamer played, an integral role on Georgia's staff. At the very beginning of the Kirby Smart days, was the special teams coordinator and the tight end coach under Kirby Smart for, I believe it was 2 years, and then left after the 2017 Rose Bowl to OU, where he took on the same duties there before getting the job at South Carolina. Went 7-6 his first year, then turned it around and went 8-5. And now this is, I mean, relatively, this is, he had much of the same players that his predecessor have. Will Muschamp, who is now family affair back at Georgia. So, I mean, what's been the biggest difference before we start getting into the season? What's kind of been the biggest difference that you've seen with Beamer that may have been missing under Muschamp, if you will?
Harrison, I'll give you two things. The first thing that I'm going to go with is I think that the culture and mindset in the building is a different one from what Will Muschamp had at South Carolina. Now, to dive into this a little bit further, when Will Muschamp was here at South Carolina, the main thing that stuck out to everybody when it came to marketing, trying to sell your program to some of these young high school kids, Will Muschamp always went to, we can get you developed for the NFL. We can send you to the league. And that's all well and good to a certain extent. But I think the main problem for Will Muschamp that caught up to him at some point in terms of culture was that he overemphasized it. The staff overemphasized it. And so you had a lot of players that were coming into the program, and team success was maybe not the very first thing on their mind. It was the fact that, they were learning from Will Muschamp, who obviously is a noted defensive mind. Tavarius Robinson has had some really good years as a defensive coach as well under Will Muschamp. And so they were coming here, and their thought was, how to get to the NFL. And so it led to more of an individual based mentality. And it's sort of, I don't want to say fractured the locker room, but I don't think the team was quite together. And that sounds cliche for a lot of football fans out there. But honest to gosh, you've got to have team chemistry. I mean, Georgia's found this out over the past couple of years. I mean, you've got to have everybody locked in arms and have their vision all focused on the same exact thing if you want to be able to win championships. Will Muschamp did not have that. Shane Beamer has corrected that overnight. And then the other thing is player development. Will Muschamp recruited quite well during his time at South Carolina. I think that many people would say to this point that Will Muschamp and Shane Beamer, in terms of recruiting, they've about matched each other in terms of the final rankings and the players they've brought in. The difference so far, in my opinion, Harrison, is Shane Beamer has gotten more out of the guys that they've brought in. Will Muschamp, over time, they didn't. On paper, they should have been probably around 7, 8, 9 wins at the minimum. And then after a couple years, maybe pushing Georgia in the Eastern Division. But that never took place. Shane Beamer, at least so far, he's done more with what he's had. And that's evidenced by the top 25 wins over, obviously, Tennessee and Clemson, and also win over Kentucky in Lexington, the first time since 2012 that South Carolina won up there in Kentucky. people might be shocked by that, but Kentucky, I mean, they've gotten better. They've been a thorn in South Carolina's side for several years, and Shane Beamer got a lot of monkeys off South Carolina's back this past year, defeating Kentucky, defeating Texas A&M, defeating Clemson, and obviously that Tennessee game that we're always going to go back to at some point. So bottom line, Shane Beamer's done more with what he has had so far, and the culture is just night and day here in Columbia, and that's led to a lot of benefits so far for Coach Beamer and this staff.
Going back to your 2021 season over there at South Carolina, obviously South Carolina gets 2 wins in the opening weeks. You play Georgia 40-13, wasn't very competitive. You go to Kentucky, and like you said, they were thrown in your side for a while. You even played them close in year 1, 16-10. And it's not just South Carolina, even Georgia. When Georgia plays Kentucky, it's actually something Dan brings up when he and I speak. So Kentucky always finds a way to make you play ugly. It is the ugliest game of the year for Georgia for some reason. That, and when they occasionally go to Mizzou, as you can see last year, very ugly. But there was already a big win. You get that win over Florida, and I know tail end of Dan Mullen, maybe not at the top of mind at that point, and you also beat Auburn that year. So I mean, definitely year 1 showed a lot more than Muschamp really probably ever did, just other than the win in 19 over Georgia. Really, I've never heard that story about what's the difference. And so I appreciate Andrew giving us that. I don't know how many people in the Georgia space, or at least in Georgia's fan base, know the difference. And now we're, starting to get an understanding for it. So let's kind of get into this preview here. You've already mentioned the offense and Spencer Rattler. You lose Marshawn Lloyd. I believe he went to
Southern Cal. Yeah, the Trojans.
Southern Cal. I'm not going to get into that. I have a rant on that one, but I'm going to say that one for later. Let's talk about somebody, because I've seen this guy on my timeline, and you've already mentioned him before, Antoine Wells. He's already picking up NFL traction already, and it's mid-July, and there's already talk about him being a player to watch, somebody who could really boost their draft stock here in this coming season. Tell us a little bit more about Antoine Wells and kind of the other weapons that Spencer Rattler has to use this year.
Yeah, for sure. So Antoine Juice Wells, I mean, when we talk about weapons on South Carolina's offense, it all starts with him. The thing that separates Antoine Juice Wells from a lot of the guys at his position, Harrison, again, this is going to sound cliche, it's going to sound simple, but if you follow Antoine Juice Wells' journey at all, then you would really understand this guy just has a different mentality. This is a guy that literally eats, sleeps, and breathes the game of football. Grew up in a rough situation during his childhood, and it just sort of instilled a mentality in him that, he wanted to get himself out of that situation. He wants to get his family maybe in a better situation back at home, and he's carried that with him into college ball. I think he started actually at Fort Union Military Academy, and then went from there to James Madison, where he set multiple school records, was an FCS All-American, I believe, in just his second year up there playing for the Dukes. And then he goes to South Carolina this past fall, and the only question mark that fans really have, Harrison, is can he elevate his play up to SEC competition? The start of the year, besides a couple games, it took him a little bit, but about halfway through the season, he really started to figure things out. I want to say the Kentucky game was the first game he really started to make a big impact for this team. And then you look at the Tennessee and Clemson games, Harrison, go look at the box score. The biggest numbers that stand out are attached to Antoine Juice Wells. This is a guy that just makes plays, and he makes plays in big-time football games when you need them the most. He is their number 1 weapon. Now, some other guys to know for South Carolina's offense, you got Xavier Legette. He's one of those guys that he's always had potential. He's got the build. He's got the athleticism, but he's never been able to put it quite together consistently for a whole season. South Carolina believes that he could be their wide receiver number 2 on the team this year, but we're still a little bit wait-and-see mode on that. They got a really underrated transfer from Memphis and Eddie Lewis. This is a kid that had around 600 yards for the Tigers last year, was a threat on both offense and special teams. I think he's a guy that is going to end up doing a lot more than some people realize once this season starts. And then at the tight end position, South Carolina lost Jaheim Bell this offseason. A lot of people would imagine that means that they're downgrading at tight end. South Carolina might have actually somehow gotten deeper at that spot. They added Trey Knox from Arkansas. Trey Knox has always been a reliable target at that position, transitioning from wide receiver to tight end a couple years back in Fayetteville. And then Josiah Simon from Western Kentucky, I believe. He's a South Carolina native, so he's coming back home to play for the Gamecocks. And he's a kid that I believe owns the school record for touchdowns by a tight end for Western Kentucky. He's a guy that played against Auburn this past season, I believe, and Simon was a guy that the Tigers had a lot of issues covering. And I know that Auburn finished 5-7, one of the worst seasons they had in a very long time. But Simon is an SEC caliber player, and there's a lot of NFL people already that are sort of looking at him and saying that's a guy that could be maybe a potential day 2, I guess, if he plays well enough, or at the very least, a day 3 draft pick. So those are the main areas to watch, or the main players to watch on South Carolina's offense. Running back is a bit of a question mark. You got a bunch of guys that can do different things, specialized skill sets. Eugene McDowell's probably the name that Bulldog fans will recall the most in terms of how long he's been here. But otherwise, they got to find a number one guy there. So Spencer Rattler, Juice Wells, Xavier Legette, and you've also got Nicholas Harper. My gosh, how can I about forget to mention him? 5-star athlete out of the Washington, D.C. area, 6'5", 241. He runs a 4.3 40-yard dash.
Ooh.
I probably don't need to say a whole lot more beyond that, but needless to say, look out for number 8 on South Carolina's offense. I guarantee you he is going to see the field at wide receiver this fall, and at some point, he will start to make some plays for the Gamecocks offense.
Hey, shout out to Roots for already getting his questions in the ear for Andrew. Andrew's already doing a great job. Already knocked out one of my next questions talking about the loss of Jaheim Bell. Andrew, before we get into Roots' second question about the defense, there's one part of the offense that I think when everybody talks about what's it going to take to beat Georgia or at least compete with Georgia is what's that offensive line look like? Now, you've seen it be the difference for Tennessee. Tennessee has the weapons out wide. I don't know. You know, when you talk about Georgia's defense found, has covered Tennessee's offense and their schematic system really, really well. But their offensive line hasn't been there. So what is that looking like for SC up front? How is Beamer recruiting that group? Because really in the Saban smart, mantra of this is how we're going to play football, it all starts up front.
Yeah, Harrison, you're absolutely right about that. And with South Carolina's offensive line, in simple terms, it's not a good situation right now. Now, am I going to say it's dire? No, not necessarily. But South Carolina lost a ton of experience from their offensive line unit this past season. If you need an idea of how much experience, over 100 combined starts, just from center to right tackle. That obviously is never good for any offensive line unit to lose that much continuity and experience from those kind of guys. A couple of fifth-year players, a 6-year player in Eric Douglas at center, who was certainly a vital component of the Gamecocks' offensive surge late last season. And so right now they're in a bit of a transition year. And so you got a lot of guys that have been backups for a couple years. They're probably going to get their shot, but then you got some young guys. And the good news for South Carolina on their end is Shaver and the staff have done a phenomenal job of recruiting the offensive line. You look at 2023, that recruiting class. Marky Anderson's the biggest name that's going to jump out. I'm pretty sure he's a kid that Georgia dispensed an offer to in that cycle. He is going to play in year 1. Shane Beamer has already said that. Now, is he going to start the whole year? Probably not, but look out for him to be a kid that comes into the fold at some point halfway through this season. Some other guys, Oluwatosin Big Tree Babalade. He's another kid that could maybe make an impact, but he's a bit raw in terms of technique, but a 4-star kid out of the state of Maryland. And then 2024, somehow they are even better. They got Cam Pringle and Josiah Thompson, 2 big-time offensive tackles, probably the best offensive tackle class out of the state of South Carolina that we've ever seen at the high school level. Both top 100 prospects. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say they're going to start year 1. It's tough for freshmen to start on the offensive line. But those 2 kids, South Carolina believes that they could help turn the tide in this position unit. And they got a kid, Blake Franks, from Greenville High School in South Carolina, who could also develop into a nice player. But bottom line, right now, it's not exactly great. South Carolina's going to have to probably grin and bear the situation there at the offensive line. Nick Gargiulo is probably the best offensive lineman, and he transferred him from Yale. So we'll see how the other guys gel around him. But look out for some of these other guys in the future. South Carolina, they're not going to be able to match up with Georgia right now. But 2025, 2026 might be a different conversation.
And here's another question from Room. Type of O-line scheme: pin and pull, head on push, zone. Do you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, I can. So not a lot of pin and pull. That was a lot of stuff that they did sort of when Brian McClendon, ironically enough, was the offensive coordinator here in 2019.
Another family affair.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of connections here between Georgia and South Carolina coaches. But Mike Bobo also did that a good amount, but I'm sure, of course, Georgia fans, they know that very well. It's certainly a mixture of both zone blocking and just regular old power blocking. South Carolina likes to run a lot of ISO. They like to run a lot of duo up front on the offensive line, but they also like to run their zone schemes. And especially with Marshawn Lloyd this past year, zone runs were something that even with South Carolina's sort of lackluster offensive line play at times, they're able to make things happen because of a guy like Marshawn Lloyd back there. And again, I mentioned earlier, the running back room, still not exactly where they probably would want it right now, but they got some guys that, again, have specialized skill sets that can sort of fit different concepts, fit different blocking schemes in this offense. So you get a little bit of everything in South Carolina's offense, and that's sort of what they look for to try to maintain a balance so that they can, kind of catch their opponent's defenses a little bit more on their heels when they play these football games.
And to get in a little bit more on the offense, because we've already knocked out a lot of questions. Andrew's given us great answers. I've learned more about South Carolina in these 20 minutes than I have in probably the last 6 months. So Andrew, like I said earlier, thank you for coming on here, because it's always a game that Georgia fans are going to circle on their calendar because of obviously what happened in 2019. No matter how good South Carolina is, no matter how bad they are, Georgia fans are going to get up for that game because they know, if Georgia doesn't come to play and South Carolina, if even if they're a bad team, they come to play and you don't, that can end up in an L.
Yeah.
So just interesting to watch. Before we hop into the defense, I did want to ask you, and I'd be remiss if I didn't. Obviously, you spoke about it earlier. You got rid of Marcus Satterfield, brought in Dow Loggins, an NFL guy who has NFL experience. I believe he came from Arkansas. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You're correct. Yeah.
What have you seen or heard kind of in the lead up to fall camp? I know some schools start next week or maybe the week after next. So what have you kind of heard from that? I know it's early and you don't see everything. Obviously, you're not going to see really anything from the spring game. But if any notes that you can add to the conversation kind of about that transition.
Yeah, so the thing with Dow Loggins, Harrison, he has been brought into South Carolina's football program to basically try to help streamline this offense. In essence, South Carolina stylistically, they're not going to change a whole lot. However, they are going to, again, try to simplify some things, make sure that the playbook's not as comprehensive, and that Dow Loggins is going to be able to just get that information to Spencer Rattler and therefore help this offense continue to have some really solid football games like they did at the end of this past football season. Dow Loggins, he does come from the NFL. I believe he has about 16 years of experience total, and 9 of those years were spent as an offensive play caller. Now, some people look back at the offenses he was a part of, and they would say, well, this guy didn't do good at the NFL, so are we sure he's going to do good at the collegiate level? First of all, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison there, and I'm sure that a lot of Georgia fans would absolutely understand that with the amount of NFL coaches that they've brought in or guys with NFL backgrounds they've had come into their football program. So Dow Loggins, he's going to run this offense through Spencer Rattler. And obviously, I think everybody would want to see that if you're a South Carolina fan. But it's going to start with Spencer Rattler. Then he's going to look at the skill sets of the offensive line, and then he branches out to the wide receivers. That's sort of his overall philosophy in terms of how he wants to build this playbook for the Gamecocks. And the thing with Dow Loggins, he said that his time at Arkansas helped him tremendously in terms of learning how to, again, sort of cater to these kids at the college level. Because in the NFL, Harrison, I mean, you probably obviously know this if you cover the NFL, they have to spend a lot of time in the film room, but they could just talk ball all day long. There's no real restrictions once they're all there in the building at the same time. But that's not the case in these college programs. You got guys that have got class. You got guys that maybe have, girlfriend issues or, they're wanting to hang out with all their friends. And so Dow Loggins, he learned at Arkansas that, you have to find a different way to get the information to these 18 to 22-year-old kids. It's not like the NFL. And hearing him say that, I think that in year one, this hire is going to be better or at least show more progress than some people might think. I understand the fear of the unknown, considering the fact that he hasn't been to college level before as a play caller, but Gamecock fans, I think, have a hidden optimism when it comes to the offense this year. And Dow Loggins, again, the overall system, it's not going to change a whole lot, but the verbiage will. And the hope is that that's going to help Spencer Rattler carry over what he did late last season into 2023. And then you could see it for 12 games. And who knows? If that happens, South Carolina could certainly end up winning even more football games this upcoming fall.
So you talk about the verbiage changing and maybe trying to streamline this for Spencer Rattler. So, is this going to be like a spread type deal? Is it going to be similar to what I know South Carolina initially went after the younger Riley brother, for OC back when Beamer first came in. Is that what we're going towards over in South Carolina, or are they going towards maybe what our Kendall Browse did with Arkansas? Like what's that look like at the end of the day, you think?
Yeah, good question. So for the offense this year, I think based on the weapons that they've got out wide at wide receiver and tight end, the situation at the offensive line, I think that South Carolina, they've been running a lot of under center formations the past couple years, along with some shotgun, some spread. I think you'll see a lot more shotgun and spread formations from this offense in 2023 because, quite frankly, they're going to have to. I think it'd be ridiculous for them not to. I think you'll see a lot more of 11 personnel, one running back, one tight end, three wideouts on the field pretty much at all times. You might see some short yardage situations where they're going to maybe have a jumbo package, maybe Simon Knox, and maybe even their third tight end, Nick Elksnis, who's a noted good blocker that transferred him from Florida. You might see that from time to time, but overall, I think this is going to be a touch more of your modern spread and pace and space. That's sort of what Dow Loggins said back in the spring. He wants to use tempo selectively at times when the offense is flowing well and wants to take advantage of the, wider hash marks that you have in the college game, again, compared to the NFL level. And so take advantage of everybody as much as you can. And basically let Spencer Rattler going to throw the football more. And I'm not sure if it's going to be a one-off or this is going to be something they're going to continue to go with in the near future. But for this season, at the minimum, it's going to be more of a spread type offense. And I think that you'll see Dow Loggins try to get creative in that spread offense in terms of how they get the football out to multiple guys from Spencer Rattler's hands.
Yeah, so that already gives us our answer. And it's actually really cool that you mentioned, the wider hash marks. He wants to spread defenses out, wants to use those wide hash marks. That is a staple at Tennessee. And even some of the Browse. Our Browse, I don't know, Kendall, obviously used some wider hash marks. So yeah, you pick up things along the way. And that's a good sign from a coordinator. Like you said, you don't know what it looks like in 2 years, or kind of, year to year after Spencer leaves, but he is trying to make that offense, as Spencer Rattler friendly as possible. Let's talk about defense. Correct me if I'm wrong. South Carolina does not bring back much that I read on defensively. So, but you do have South Carolina does bring back obviously your defensive coordinator. You have some retention there with Clayton White. He was somebody I've seen on the timeline a lot. Gets praise from not only the media, but also the South Carolina fans, at least from what I've seen. What's your take on the defense this year, heading into this season after coming off of, by all means, a really good season?
Yeah, Harrison, this is a pivotal year for defensive coordinator Clayton White, to be honest. In 2021, he was a Broyles Award, I believe, semifinalist or at least a nominee for the award. And clearly, coordinators that are nominated for that award, you've had a really good season in your role. But the big issue, Harrison, over the past 2 years for the Gamecocks has been rush defense. The Gamecocks, I believe, have ranked at least 90th or worse in the country in rush defense, both of Shane Beamer's years so far. And it has been a constant message this offseason. Shane Beamer, Clayton White, some of the defensive players themselves have said, rush defense has got to be better. And there's been multiple issues that have sort of led to rush defense being a problem. There's been some issues in terms of reading and reacting to mesh points at the edge position. There's been some issues with probably maintaining, your lane or gap integrity at the linebacker position. And, there's also just been a lack of overall depth. Now, the depth issue has started to get corrected. There's a lot of good depth at the defensive tackle position. That spot is led by Tonka Hemingway. I think he could be an all-SEC type player for South Carolina this year. Zach Pickens, yes, moves on to the NFL. Tonka Hemingway is going to slide right on into that spot and be the same kind of player that Zach Pickens was for South Carolina in 2023. You've got some other good players there as well. At linebacker, you lose 12 years of experience with Sherrod Green and Brad Johnson, both moving on after exhausting all of their eligibility. But again, a deeper position. And honestly, you're probably going to get a little bit of a plus in terms of athleticism and the ability to stop the run. Debo Williams is a very aggressive downhill linebacker that's not afraid to be shot out of a cannon, just take his chances in the backfield. And then Stone Bland, he's kind of like more of your modern day run stopper where he can go sideline to sideline as well as go downhill. The secondary has been the best unit for South Carolina on this side of the ball since Shane Beamer got here back in the 2020 offseason. Torian Gray, he's one of the best secondary coaches in the entire country. I believe that Matrix Analytical Solutions, if y'all have heard of that, one of the best out there in terms of just sort of rating these coaches and players, they rated Torian Gray as one of the best secondary coaches in the SEC, first team All SEC coach. He has sent multiple guys to the NFL. He's developed guys. Jalen Foster was a walk-on in 2021, became an All-American under Gray's watch. Obviously, Cam Smith and Darius Rush just both got sent out to the NFL. They get a guy, Marcellus Dial, back for their third season. He's a fifth-year senior at corner. He's probably going to be expected to lead that group at that spot. So this defense, the depth is better, but they certainly do lose some starters. And, that edge position, if you got to label sort of any concern outside rush defense, it's probably that edge spot, which unfortunately, means your pass rush is probably going to hurt some as well. Gilbert Edmond, Jordan Burch, both transferring out. Jordan Burch obviously shocked everyone at South Carolina because he was born and raised basically in this state, goes all the way out to Oregon. Gilbert Edmond transfers to Florida State, so he does go back closer to home. But that leaves you hurting a little bit in terms of depth. They feel like they've got some guys there. Jordan Stratton led the nation in sacks 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, I should say, in the COVID year, but he tore his ACL last year. Second time he's torn an ACL. What are you going to see out of him? Jatius Skier transfers in from Syracuse, was a solid player of the ACC. Same thing with Terrell Dawkins, who transferred in this past year from NC State, but you don't know what you're going to get. So basically, just a lot of unproven commodities at that spot. So for South Carolina, rush defense, their number one priority this season. They've got to correct that if they want to continue to progress on the field. And pass rush, just based on sort of the lack of experience, that could also be an issue there as well.
You mentioned Jordan Burch, and I know we've said family affair a couple times with the coaching staff here. What's funny about that situation is, Andrew, Georgia was in on that one. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Dan Lanning was very heavily a presence in that recruitment, who's now the head coach over at Oregon. So it's like, the runner-up ends up getting the player afterwards thanks to the transfer portal. What impact does his loss have on this defense, if any?
Yeah. So his athleticism was a big plus for the Gamecocks in pass rush. Jordan Burch, he did not get a lot of sacks during his time in Columbia. The sack numbers, I believe he had 4.5 sacks in 2022. So a lot of people probably sit there and say, well, that's not that big of a loss. Well, in modern college football now, you can't just look at the sack numbers anymore. You got to look at the pressure rates, the havoc rates that these guys have up front. Jordan Burch was one of the best on this team and probably one of the best in the SEC in terms of his pressure rate from that defensive end spot. The Gamecocks are going to be hurting there because of that. There's nobody else on this roster right now, maybe outside Desmond Meozulu, who's a true freshman who could end up contributing this year, that can be close to matching the athleticism that Jordan Burch brought to the field. So they're going to be hurting really badly in that. He was not the best rush defender, I will say, so I don't think, honestly, that in that area it's as big of a loss. But Gilbert Edmond, he brought a little bit of both. Good pass rusher, smart football player, did a great job in rush defense more often than not. He did a little bit of both at that spot. So, yeah, to your point, losing both those guys, it's going to hurt South Carolina's defensive line, no question, to this season. So some of these guys, they're going to have to grow up fast. They got to find out who's going to be able to help them out when they get into fall camp in August.
I got a few questions from Dan earlier today that we wanted to talk over. First one being, and this was an interesting one, something we haven't touched on. Well, yeah, we've touched on Shane Beamer kind of extensively, but we haven't touched on kind of the perception. Now, when I think of South Carolina historically, to me, the expectation of South Carolina is you're winning 8 to 9 games, pretty much every year. Yes, you can have a down year where maybe you don't go with a bowl, but every year need to be, in bowl contention, and every once in a while, at least maybe fighting for a spot in the East. And now, that goes out the door because the East is going away. But what is the fan perception regarding Shane Beamer? This is year 3. In my opinion, he's had a successful first 2 years. Very successful first 2 years, kind of getting back to that mold of basically averaging, 8 to 9 wins a season. What is that perception that you have gauged regarding the fans and their thoughts on Shane Beamer?
Harrison, the fans love Shane Beamer to death right now because, honestly, they look at Shane Beamer as one of their own. I mean, Shane Beamer actually was born here in the state of South Carolina, I believe down in Charleston, back when Frank Beamer, a long time ago, was an assistant coach, I believe, at the Citadel, which is a military school down there close to Charleston, South Carolina. So Shane Beamer, he's always felt like he's had a connection to this state. He, of course, came back here. 2007 was the first year he was an assistant coach under Steve Spurrier, obviously, who I've got in the photo right here for those of you who are watching this on YouTube right now. But,
You're giving Georgia fans nightmares with that photo.
yeah. But Shane Beamer, when he came back here in 07, stayed here through 2010, the year that South Carolina did make an appearance in the SEC championship game. He and his family, they loved it here. They sort of always felt like that they had roots planted here. A couple of his kids were born here while he was an assistant coach. And so he's mentioned this before. He's always kind of wanted to come back here. And South Carolina fans, the thing that they want out of their coaches is obviously they want you to win. They want you to have success in your program. But for South Carolina fans, where the fan support is unmatched in terms of maybe how they're viewed amongst other teams, they want guys that care. And Shane Beamer cares a lot about South Carolina. And so because of that, they have basically decided, you know what, we're all in on this guy. No matter what happens, so far, we've got no reason to doubt him. So let's just strap in and buckle up, and we're going to see how this entire thing's going to unfold. And the thing is, because he knows South Carolina so well, clearly it's helped him in recruiting, and clearly it has helped him be able to sell this program, relate to players. He is the perfect CEO type of coach for the modern day college football. He's not a guy that's maybe a coordinator outside of special teams, but he's someone that understands what he needs to do to run an organization. Think about this. He is coached under guys like Philip Fulmer, Frank Beamer, Kirby Smart, Lincoln Riley, Steve Spurrier, George O'Leary, Sylvester Croom. A ton of those guys are College Football Hall of Fame coaches or will be when their careers are over. Nobody seems to bring that up with Shane Beamer when it comes to the question of how's he going to do long term? Can he be successful at South Carolina? So I think that for Shane Beamer, when it comes to his perception at South Carolina, the fans, they just absolutely love that about him. They love the pedigree that he has. They love the resume he has, but they love above all else that he cares deeply about the football program.
I'm dealing with some barking dogs, as you may hear. So I'm gonna try and get this question off and go quiet them down real quick. Dan's second question, and you've kind of spoken about this kind of at length in regards to recruiting. Thank God they shut up. You've been recruiting at a level, like you said, where I'm flustered now. Gosh, they took you out of the rhythm. You've been recruiting South Carolina's been recruiting at a level similar to where Will Muschamp had it. Dan wants to know, and this I think it's going to be necessary if you do want to take that next step. Can they recruit at that level necessary to win the East? Like, can they get up there, kind of around where Tennessee's right now, where they're kind of top 10, maybe top 8, maybe top 4 every once in a while? But is it a resources thing? What do they need to get to that level if you don't feel like they can right now?
Well, Harrison, I think for South Carolina, the important thing is you've got to continue to find ways to sustain the success that you're having, not just on the football field, but as you just talked about in recruiting. There's no question in this sport, there are programs, and we see this every single year, no matter how bad they've been over the past 10, 15, 20 years, they're given a pass. They're given the benefit of the doubt because they've at least shown they could do it before. To a certain degree, you understand it, but also it's like, at what point do you question what those programs are going to be able to do in the future? Anyways, that's a whole nother rant I could go on for minutes and minutes on end. But with South Carolina, relating that back to them, South Carolina's not a program that can afford to have like maybe more than one down year. They can't have 2, 3 down years consecutively. And so because they've done well so far, you've seen the recruiting have an uptick. I think the first year they were like 24th in recruiting. Then this past cycle, they were 17th. Right now they're about 18th, but they're still in the game for several big-time prospects. I think Dylan Stewart's the biggest name by far. I know Georgia is still in there for him as well. So they feel like that they could still get a top 12 class possibly by the end of this cycle. But the thing is, they've got to hit that 50% blue chip ratio. I don't think that in the modern recruiting era, Harrison, there's ever been a team that had less than a 50% blue chip ratio on their roster, and they won the entire thing. So if you're South Carolina, you're not going to get 7, 8, 5 stars, right? But how many 4 stars are you getting? Are you getting over 50%? Or are you getting just about 6, 7, or 8? Do you drop to that level for a couple years in a row? If that happens, then you're going to just make your timeline to possibly winning a title or contending for titles even longer. You're going to lengthen that out. And the Gamecocks cannot afford to do that. So I would say that for recruiting, again, maybe try to aim for top 15. That probably means that you're also hitting a 50% blue chip ratio. And if you can continue to stack that, if you're Shane Beamer, you're going to keep on getting depth. And at the same time, eventually, you'll find some diamonds in the rough. Ladd McConkey, best example for Georgia. Nobody recruited that kid. And everybody knows his name because he's one of the best players on the Bulldogs offense. So you do that, South Carolina can absolutely contend possibly for championships in a couple of years.
See, and you bring up a good point. The 50% stat, I actually don't know that off the top of my head. I'm impressed that you know that. So that's, you bring up a really good point, and it's like you don't have, as Rudes kind of says down here, you don't have the resources that Texas A&M, not even Georgia has the pocketbook that Texas A&M has, and Texas also, they both have that checkbook. For South Carolina, it has to be a good mix of, we're going to recruit these top-rated players, these guys that are on the blue chip, in the blue chip ratio, show up on that stat sheet. But you also got to take your swings at, like you said, the diamonds in the rough. You got to go get a Ladd McConkey every year, every other year. You got to go try and develop, but you don't want to go the Dan Mullen route of, no, I don't care about recruiting. I'm going to get who I get. I'm going to develop them. It's a good mix. And like you said, top 15, top 12, I think that's the perfect range to keep them, second, at least second in the East, at least third in the East. But every once in a while, you can make the challenge. Because as you've seen, even at the top of college football right now, there is turnover. Alabama is hurt by it pretty much, it seems, in every other year now. Whether it's by the staff, whether it's through the transfer portal. Georgia has some guys going out in the transfer portal, even if they're a big time player for that offense, A.D. Mitchell. So yeah, Andrew brings some great points there regarding South Carolina recruiting. Last one before we get into some schedule talk, and then we're going to let you go because I don't want to hold you up too long. Dan wants to know, does South Carolina have a plan B if Spencer Rattler goes down? What is the future in that room? And then is there anybody else that might be nipping at his heels, if so to speak?
Harrison, I got the perfect answer for you. So I actually just talked about this on a podcast that I also run called the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Shameless plug. I'm just going to throw that in there right now. But I throw that in to say this. They got a backup quarterback right now, Lenore Sellers. This kid is 6'3", 6'4", 245 pounds. And it's not bad weight. He was a 4-star kid coming out of South Florence High School in Florence, South Carolina in the 2023 recruiting cycle. Syracuse found him early. Give credit to the Orange. They developed a long-lasting relationship with him. He was hurt his junior year, so therefore he didn't have a whole lot of film. That hurt him in terms of evaluation. But South Carolina paid attention to his senior season. He went off. The kid, I think, had like 60-plus total touchdowns and just 2 interceptions the entire season. He can throw the football already about 55 yards flat-footed. He's somebody that probably runs like a 4.6, 4.5, 40-yard dash. And again, he's 6'3", 6'4", 245 pounds. And I brought my podcast early because I made the argument or the case today or earlier this week that this kid, he has some traits that's reminiscent of Cam Newton. And if it's not Cam Newton, look at KJ Jefferson at Arkansas. He's got that kind of talent. Lenore Sellers, he's the future of that quarterback room. They've got a kid in Tanner Bailey that they got out of Alabama, a really good find for Shane Beamer and this program late in the 2022 recruiting cycle. He was, I think, committed to Oregon at one point then. So they did get Tanner Bailey. He's a solid player that can make different throws, can operate out of the pistol, can sort of operate in play action concepts, which is huge for a offense that still wants to have some pro-stylish concepts involved. And then Dante Reno, a kid from the 2024 class, participated in the Elite 11, made it to the Elite 11 finals earlier this offseason. He's not going to have the athleticism or like the just large build of Lenore Sellers, and he probably doesn't have necessarily the off-platform throwing ability that a Tanner Bailey has. But Dante Reno is accurate. And every single coach that you talk to in this sport will say, there's one thing I want of my quarterbacks, it's accuracy. Because accuracy is just hard to change. It's hard to improve that. So South Carolina, to put it bluntly, they've got a ton of good options there. But the Lenore Sellers, he is the name to watch in the future. People in the program think he could be special. They think he might be the best quarterback to ever play here. They think he's got that kind of potential. So Lenore Sellers, watch out for him. 2023, he might get certain packages just for himself, just because of how good he already is and what he could offer to the offense because of the lack of running back, talent, I guess, at that spot. So look out for him in 2023 and for the next couple of seasons.
Just from what you described, and I I recognize that name from my time covering Georgia and looking at college recruiting. He's a guy that, like I said, just by me following a few South Carolina guys on Twitter, he's a name that popped up. I believe it was last year. I want to say last year popped up. And for what you described, that sounds an elite arm, and it sounds like he may have some elite athleticism to him. If he's going to play that big arm, athletic quarterback role that Cam Newton played and KJ Jefferson still plays today. It's going to be interesting. I know he was pretty highly rated coming out of high school. Maybe not as high as you said as he could have been, but for Spencer Rattler, it's like, oh man, do I have another freshman stud coming in behind me? To maybe nip at his heels. But I'm not of the opinion that Spencer Rattler is going to be, in contention here. And from what you said, he's the starting quarterback. But the future is bright there, as you said, in that quarterback room. Andrew, let's get into the schedule real quick, and this is going to be brief. You open up with North Carolina, the northern rivals. I don't even know. Is it a rivalry? Or is it just, hey, you're close in proximity?
It's a bigger rivalry if you ask like my dad or my grandfather, but in terms of our generation, it's not as prevalent as maybe once used to be, but still definitely bragging rights between both those schools.
A 7:30 kick, ABC. It's prime time, man. You have the prime time slot and the opening week 1. I'm not going to recognize week 0. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to do it. How you see that game going? They got Drake May coming back. Kind of interesting 2024 quarterback matchup there. Drake May versus Spencer Rattler. What's the expectation come week 1?
Well, the media is going to eat this game up because you just mentioned it. Drake May versus Spencer Rattler. I mean, you talk about a quarterback matchup. That's probably the best quarterback matchup, maybe outside of possibly Riley Leonard and Cade Klubnik in that Duke Clemson game. But obviously, again, we're talking about South Carolina here. I think that, Harrison, you could see a lot of points scored in this game. Drake May obviously was phenomenal in this North Carolina offense last year that was led by Phil Longo. But the thing that I think that people are doing in this game already, and South Carolina fans are going to jump all over this, and they've backed this up. Drake May, he's almost gotten so much hype this offseason that North Carolina's deficiencies are not being looked at. I just mentioned earlier, Phil Longo is now gone. And I think that Phil Longo, he does not get enough credit for just how well he did with Sam Howell before Drake May even started, and then Drake May this past fall. You also lose your top 2 pass catchers if you're North Carolina from this past fall. Your left tackle is gone. Oh, and to get to the defense for North Carolina, they ranked like 100th or worse in multiple major statistical categories.
Not and great, yet, bub.
Yeah, exactly. And yet most of those coaches are back, and nobody's bringing that up. It's just like, okay, well, we're just going to narrow this down to the quarterback position. We think Drake May's better, so we're going to pick North Carolina by a smidge. That's what everybody's doing. I'm going to tell you right now, South Carolina, they're going to win this game. They're going to win this game. It's going to be kind of close, but I think that South Carolina, honestly, from top to bottom of the roster, they've got more guys than North Carolina does. And at the beginning, might still be close, but that third, fourth quarter, I think South Carolina pulls away. I think special teams obviously could help them out. They returned their kicker, their punter, and the long snapper. And again, I know people might laugh at that, but you watch South Carolina's football team, special teams really has an impact for them in these football games. It helped them win against Clemson. It helped them win against Texas A&M last year. It helped them stay close with Notre Dame because of a touchdown they got in that game. So that could be the X factor that helps to put them over the top. But needless to say, a lot of points, but I still think that South Carolina's got the edge there.
Now, Andrew's not giving financial advice, and neither am I, but I just looked up this line, UNC -3. I think Andrew's kind of hint, winking. You may want to rethink that one.
Put money Carolina down on it. +3. South Carolina plus, put money down. If you want to double down, go money line. Hey, I'm not going to stop you, but it's not my money.
The over-under? We're not a betting show, but what about that over-under, 61.5?
Oh, 61.5. Now that's a good number. That's a good number from Vegas. I'll go over, but my confidence is not as high as the other one. So at least with money line and spread, take those. But 61.5, that might be enticing on an over right there.
Hey, not financial advice again. He's just saying, it's his prediction. It's what he may do. So there you go. Exactly. Georgia at Georgia, obviously. Williams-Brice, man, I remember that. It was like 90 degrees second, third week into September right there. Hot. And, I mean, when I think of Georgia going to Williams-Brice, that's always the image. It's 90 degrees. That place is packed. It is loud. It's coming to Sanford this year. Like I said, earlier, 2019, you pulled the upset. You got a 4% win percentage or win chance if you're South Carolina, according to ESPN. They don't have a line on this that at least I'm seeing. Andrew, if South Carolina pulls the upset, what needs to happen?
Spencer Rattler's got to go off. He's got to have a Tennessee-like performance like he did this past fall. So I'm not going to say that you're going to score 63 points against Georgia. So Bulldog fans, please don't misconstrue that. But Spencer Rattler probably needs like 3-4 touchdowns, 300 yards plus. Defense, you're not going to be able to stop Georgia, but can you at least sort of stymie them? Can you at least make them have to really work a little bit harder to go downfield? Because last season, you didn't do that. And that's how they scored 40-plus points. Special teams for South Carolina. Again, I cannot emphasize it enough. It is a massive, massive factor for the Gamecocks. Kai Kroger, can you pin the ball deep inside the 20 multiple times? Again, can you force Georgia to be a touch uncomfortable? And here's the other thing. Look, Georgia, from a talent standpoint, and especially in the trenches, they should win this game. I think that they will win this game. However, it cannot be overlooked. Carson Beck has never entered a season as the starting quarterback, knowing he's going to be the starting quarterback. And that is a completely different mentality that you are carrying compared to last year, where he knows he's sitting behind Stetson Bennett for another year unless he goes down with an injury. Now, I think Carson Beck's a very talented quarterback, but again, we saw what South Carolina did in 2019. They didn't necessarily get to Jake Fromm all game long, but they rattled his cage a little bit. And we saw what happened to Fromm when his cage got rattled. He made a ton of mistakes, made a lot of inaccurate throws. If South Carolina can find a way to generate some pressure on defense, make Carson Beck have to make some tough throws or tough split-second calls mentally, plus everything else I mentioned, you do that, sure, South Carolina can keep the game close, and at the end, they can have a shot to win. But at the end of the day, still, in all honesty, it's all Georgia. I'm sorry. South Carolina's not there yet.
We've seen what an inexperienced starting quarterback looks like actually relatively recently. If you're a Georgia fan, 2020 DeJuan Mathis against Arkansas, another one of those games where it's like Georgia should win this, and then deer in headlights. Like, he gets hit out of bounds by Bumper Pool, all name team right there. And just from there, it kind of spirals downhill, ends up getting Stetson Bennett his first, snaps of that year, and goes on to have the season he did. And look at the career, how that turned out. But yeah. The young quarterback, relatively inexperienced. This will be Beck's third game of the season. First true SEC, and actually first true test of the season. If you look at Georgia's schedule, South Carolina is that for Georgia. Andrew, let's talk about just your overall predictions. Other notable games on this. You go to Tennessee. You play at home against Florida, at Texas A&M. Now, Dan's not a big fan of Jimbo Fisher. I'm not buying Jimbo Fisher stock. We sold that stock a long time ago. That one's gonna be good. I can see that being prime time if A&M's having a good year, at least decent. I can see that being prime time in Kyle Field, and then you end the season versus Clemson. You play at Kentucky the week before. That's a tough stretch. Two tough physical football teams back to back. But what is your season predictions record wise for the South Carolina football team?
Well, Harrison, I think that for the first time in Shane Beamer's tenure here in Columbia, I think the Gamecocks are going to take a slight step back in terms of their final win-loss record at the end of the regular season. The thing that I keep coming back to, Harrison, and I talked about earlier, I come back to their potential problems they're going to have in the trenches. This offensive line, again, there could be some guys that completely surprise me. There could be a couple of freshmen that just astonish me and are instant impact kids, like from the beginning to the end of the season. But unless a lot of things go the Gamecocks' way there, I think that area is going to lose them a couple football games. Georgia, clearly at the very top of that list. They're not going to win that game probably because of their trench play. Tennessee, I don't think that South Carolina has to respect Tennessee's defense as much as they do Georgia. I mean, after what they did last fall, why would you? But Tennessee can generate some pressure. I think they have recorded 30-plus sacks each of the first years with Tim Banks there as their defensive coordinator. So that could be a tough game. And plus, you got 100,000 people screaming at you in Knoxville. Texas A&M, we all know they've got the talent. The question is Jimbo going to get out of the way for once? And after what he said at SEC Media Days earlier this week, I don't know. I had them at 9-3. I'm not confident about that pick right now. I'm just not. But it's also in Kyle Field. I mean, the road schedule is just brutal, man. Tennessee, Texas A&M, Missouri, I mean, they've been a thorn in South Carolina's side. That makes up for the lack of home field advantage, possibly. And then that final one, oh my gosh, it slipped my mind right now. Anyways, to get to Kentucky and Clemson at the end of the year, that's a tough spot to play Kentucky, right? Because it's the week before your rivalry matchup against the Tigers. Kentucky always plays physical. Last year was definitely a down year. Will Levis proved he's not a first-round pick. He sure as heck was never the number 1 overall pick. Whoever thought that that was the case, they need to go find another job. But their offensive line, I think, is going to be a touch improved. I always have respect for Brad White in that defense. That Wildcat defense, they do not get enough credit in this conference. They had consistently top 25 unit the past few years, and I think they're going to provide problems for South Carolina. So I guess the overall question is, do I think Spencer Rattler and these skill players can overcome the possible issues up front on offense? I just don't think they're going to be able to in some of these games. It's going to lead to some close losses. Defensively, I think they can improve. But the offense is going to have maybe more issues scoring this year because of the O-line issues. Can you get off the field more? Can you get more stops? I don't know if they could do it enough. So I think it's going to be a 6-6 season for South Carolina. I don't think it's going to go back to 2021 where some of these losses, they just get blown out of the water like they did that season. But I think that they are going to take a step back. And I think Gamecock fans, they're going to have to understand, look, this was going to happen at some point. Progression is not always linear. For South Carolina, things are still trending in the right direction. But this season might be the year, a transition year, where finally some of these losses, they do catch up to you at certain spots.
So you heard it here from Andrew first. 6-6 for the Gamecocks. Like you said, it is a brutal road slate. You got at Georgia, at Tennessee, at Texas A&M. I mean, yes, you do play Missouri on the road, and maybe Georgia. Missouri made Georgia play ugly last year, so it's not out of the realm possibility that place is going to be rocking if they have a good year under Drink over there in Missouri. Andrew, again, appreciate having you on. Would love to get you on again because you did an awesome job. Learn more about South Carolina in the 57 minutes here than I have probably in a couple years. So as Rue says, and this is what I wanted to point out and how I wanted to end the show, that is an answer for somebody who just not just watches but knows football more than a journalist. Thank you. You know what you're talking about. You know what you're talking about. You obviously know more about this team than a lot of people do, and you broke it down. So I appreciate you so much for being on here. Relatively small podcast, but we are working on building up that audience, so we appreciate you. Andrew, tell us where they can find you before we close out the show.
Yeah,
link it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Harrison, first of all, thanks for all the kind words. Roots, thank you to everybody for tuning in. In terms of where you can find me, on Twitter, my main account is at @Lyon, that's LYON_SC. You can find me there. You can also find my written work over on Gamecocks Digest on SI.com, although it's originally under that Fan Nation umbrella. So if you can't find an SI, go to Fan Nation. You can find it there. And then Locked On Gamecocks Podcast. That's another podcast I do for the Locked On Podcast Network, which also covers South Carolina. You can find that podcast both on YouTube and also wherever you get your audio podcast daily.
Hey, really great plug there. I got to work on my plugs. Might need to model after Andrew a little bit there. As always, dude, thank you again. We're definitely going to get you back on at some point because you did a great job tonight. Guys, like he said, go follow him. He's the publisher of SI.com/college/South Carolina Gamecock Digest. You can find him there. But I always do, guys, if you're trying to find a specific SI site, just search up SI, insert name here. Like, for instance, you can do SI Gamecocks. Pull it right up. Go follow him there over on Twitter. Guys, it's going to wrap it up for episode 92 of the Top Dog Talk podcast. I'm your host, Harrison Reno. We'll see you back next week with Dan Kiley. I missed his rant today, but Andrew more than made up for it. Guys, we'll see you next week.
Appreciate it.